When I look at companies trying to implement a security program, when I look at the comparison between those that are really able to design a system, make decisions quickly, deploy the budget, and get the project done quickly, there's leadership involved. There's people with really good leadership skills. The risks in the AI really comes down to the use case and what AI. So what are you using it for? What is the model you're using? I'll see IT people that are really, really good at what they do, super brilliant, that are phenomenal at securing their IT assets, but they get bogged down by being thrown this thing that the senior leadership of the business thinks is an IT matter, but that's not.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Devico Breakfast Bar. Here we speak with different people involved in the business landscape, share their expertise, delve into the latest tech trends, and explore the ins and outs of IT outsourcing. I'm Oleg Sadikov, and today I'm excited to have Darren Gallop, founder and CEO at Carbide. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss new episodes. Hey Darren, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start our podcast with a little blitz. I start a sentence and you continue. Entrepreneurship gave me
a lot of time to think about things.
Entrepreneurship deprived me.
A lot of time to do things that are not work.
Okay. My main superpower is
leading people.
My main weakness is
taking good notes and being organized.
When I'm afraid, I
think a lot, I talk a lot, I chat with a lot of people.
Could you walk us through the story of founding Carbide? Was there a specific problem or gap in the market that you wanted to address?
So go back to 2016, I was the CEO of a company called Mercado. We were a festival management platform working with some of the larger music and culture festivals in the world. We were storing and processing a lot of highly confidential data, and our system was very critical in certain operational components of the event. Some of these festivals were owned by large corporations like Live Nation and AEG Live and Disney. Once they really realized how much our product has crept into their businesses and how much their folks were using it for such critical reasons, they started to really come down on us from a security perspective, and they were highly concerned about confidentiality, integrity, availability. Also, privacy was starting to become a thing. GDPR was on the horizon. So we started to get scrutinized pretty heavily, and these corporate events started wanting us to have things like a SOC 2 report or an ISO report. And at the time, there really wasn't much of a landscape out there to help SMBs, small to medium-sized businesses, and SaaS companies go through this. So it was sort of like the traditional model of hiring a highly paid consultant and going through that process. So we did that process. We had consultants in. We did a lot of stuff ourselves because we were pretty bootstrapped. And it just through that process of doing that, it became evident that there's clearly a better way to do this. And also that this is going to be a big opportunity because everybody's going to have to do this. And the hackers are not going away anytime soon. They make too much money and it's too easy and low risk crime. And the regulatory environment was certainly going to get more tense. So that's really where the idea came from. It was a pain that we had experienced ourselves, and then kind of went through the process of trying to decipher it ourselves and saw a lot of opportunities to make it more systematic.
How has your experience with network design and security shaped your approach to managing a technology-driven organization?
It certainly helped that I had a good amount of knowledge and experience on how endpoints, how computers worked, how operating systems worked, and had a lot of experience with small to medium-sized business networks. So when it came to really looking at, the things we had to do to secure our company, there was a whole cloud element, obviously, because we had a cloud-based, cloud-hosted web application. But cloud really is an extension of network. It's really the same core principles of a local area network. You're sourcing it into an infrastructure that you don't touch and don't enter. So yeah, a lot of the concepts that we had to wrap our heads around were things that we already understood. So between me and my co-founder was a developer. So he really looked into all of the things around software development, security. I focused on securing our Wi-Fi, securing our LAN, securing our VPN, securing our endpoints. It certainly helped. Like learning cybersecurity was actually not that big of a leap when you have some understanding of the technology that you're securing. A lot of it, as you're learning it, sounds like common sense and just things you probably should do. It's really just a lot of hygiene. So it certainly helped me go from being somebody who didn't think I knew a lot about cybersecurity to once I kind of wrapped my head around the acronyms and the language and the colloquial speak of the industry, it just really gelled and it all made a lot of sense to me really quickly.
Both founder and CEO, what does your typical day look like? How do you balance strategic planning and day-to-day operations?
I mean, it's always a big challenge. I think that's the hardest part of being a CEO. It's the part of the job that sometimes I love, sometimes I don't love. I really like building products and solving problems. And when you start a company as a founder, that's what you're doing, because you're not really a CEO. Even if you call yourself a CEO, if it's just you and a co-founder, one or two employees, you're really just hacking away at building a product. And I actually really love that stage. You have to sort of migrate through to being a CEO and to delegate more. Like today, I still play a part in some of our product things and some of our innovation, but I've got a lot to balance and I've got people that report to me. I'm a big fan of having an executive assistant, and I think it's a good idea for folks to get that resource in their business sooner than later. It does take some time for you as an entrepreneur or as a leader to learn how to use an executive assistant in a meaningful way, and it takes some time to find the right person and then to build that rapport and relationship and set up those processes so that it works. So what that means for me is that I don't really spend much time in my inbox. I don't spend time booking meetings, or if things change in my schedule, I don't have to worry about notifying people and moving meetings around. And so that's a really helpful piece. What I do a lot of is you only have so many hours in a week, and I just turned 50 on the weekend. I'm a strong believer that you need to look after yourself, because if you're doing nothing but working and looking after your business, it can be rewarding in short spurts, but eventually you end up kind of burnt out. And I think as you get older, your tolerance for that probably goes down a little bit. So I look at my work week and I block out of my calendar. So if I look at my calendar, which is actually right in front of me right now, it's all these blocks, right? So it's like this much time I'm going to spend on this thing. So I allocate everything, and that way I can budget. I spend usually the beginning of the week and the end of the week looking at everything in the calendar and reestablishing that, are we using our time the most efficiently? Is this the most prioritized items being put in there? My assistant works with me on that. She makes sure that there's agendas and everything. She does all the follow-up. I use a recording tool, so if there's anything important in calls that needs to be sort of reviewed and done, she can go back into the call and do that. So having an ally like that is really helpful. And then the other one, these are things that I think are really valuable to do early on. I had a CFO come into my business at a pretty early stage, and I think that's important, unless you are a financial person and you like to spend your time there. But even if you are, I feel like, if you're always in the weeds, you're never coming up and talking about strategy. So having people like doing anything that's repetitive, just good to get out of it, because you need time to look at the business. You need time to speak with people. That's really what leadership is. If you're going to build a culture, especially remotely, where it doesn't just organically, naturally happen as it would if everyone's kind of stuffed in one small room, it really, you have to be deliberate about that. So that's a big one. And then, always learning. It's just really good for your brain to always be learning. And I do a lot of reading and studying about leadership, even if it's stuff that have heard this before, or maybe you knew it. But it's always like, I find when you're learning all the time about ways to be a better leader, it kind of holds you accountable, because you're like, well, yeah, I know that, but am I doing it well? Probably not, or maybe there's room for improvement. So I think those are some core things for me that help me, keep focus and have time blocked out in my calendar to think about strategic things, to think about the future, to analyze and review what's going on in the business.
In your experience, what are the biggest misconceptions people have about cybersecurity, especially when it comes to implementing in an organization?
I think the biggest one is that it's an IT matter. And obviously, there's quite a bit of security that is IT related, but it's not all IT. The bigger picture is how you understand risk and how you make sure that your security program aligns with your business's objectives and goals. And that really requires that security is factored at the C-level and even the board level of the business. And I think the biggest misconception is, we don't talk about that at the C-level, or we don't talk about that at the board level. That's an operational IT thing. Their IT manager deals with that. And in my experience, I see a lot of people struggle in the IT world to try to do things like get buy-in from people above them, document policies and procedures, and manage risk and make some of those decisions. Passing that off to IT can be really problematic. And I find a lot of times I'll see IT people that are really, really good at what they do, super brilliant, that are phenomenal at securing their IT assets, but they get bogged down by being thrown this thing that the senior leadership of the business thinks is an IT matter, but that has a lot that's soft. And then you've got your highly skilled IT person burning cycles trying to wrap their head around things that are outside of their realm of expertise. So I think that's the biggest misconception about cybersecurity, is that it's purely an IT matter. If you look at even the statistics of most hacks, there's usually some social engineering element in there that doesn't necessarily, it's not even on the IT person's radar. And it might be a salesperson or somebody in customer service in the business that gets compromised, and then there's an escalation of compromise. And by the time IT finds out about it or it hits the IT's radar, it's kind of too late. So that's the biggest one. And that's the one that when I look at companies trying to implement a security program, when I look at the comparison between those that are really able to design a system, make decisions quickly, deploy the budget, and get the project done quickly, there's leadership involved. There's people with really good leadership skills that have the ear of the CEO and or the board. I think the other big one that I see people fall culprit to is when they think about security like something you just set it up and then it's done. And that's certainly far from the case. So we see a lot of scenarios where a company puts a big effort in, and over the period of a couple of months, they put all these policies and controls, and they put these IDS, IPS, and all these great systems in.
And they never use it at the end.
Yeah, they once they get their audit, they just kind of quickly fall back to status quo. I always make the analogy, it's sort of like exercise. The easy part is building a routine and making a diet. The hard part is actually going to the gym 5 days a week and getting your rest and like eating the way you're supposed to and like diligently reflecting every month and maybe changing up your routine and constantly improving. That's where like 95% of people fail. Really, the biggest thing is discipline and practice and changing the way people do things. And that's where the businesses that get over the first hump of actually implementing the security, a lot of them fail at being able to maintain it and basically like have that discipline and have that practice.
With AI systems becoming more common in businesses, what specific risks do they introduce from the security perspective?
I mean, it depends on the degree in which an organization uses AI. I think almost every business, uses AI to some point. I think the riskiest are the ones that use AI but don't actually know how or when or who or what.
Or I would say most of the businesses think they use AI.
Right. Yeah, there's that too. But I think one of the big risks are like you've got 100 employees, you don't have an AI policy, you haven't purchased or made any decisions on how the business uses AI, and you've got 25, 30, 50% of your employees are all using their own personal ChatGPT accounts for whatever they're using it for, and you don't actually have any insight or necessarily have a good idea what that is. I think that could be risky. On some levels, there's sort of like the layers of depth, right? There's the people that think they're using AI and they're not. There's the people that are using a GPT sort of chat bot for writing things or deciphering information and things like that. And then you've got companies that are actually integrating with AI APIs to provide access to some of the data in their platforms to do some processing or some activity. And then you've got deeper range where you've got people actually training models and really innovating with AI. I think the risks, it really depends on the system. I mean, I look at AI, it's just another technology. The risks in the AI really comes down to the use case and what AI. So what are you using it for? What is the model you're using? But right now, what I see that I would say is the common sort of wild, wild west scenario is the one I described at the beginning, which is that an organization doesn't have a policy. They haven't determined what they can and cannot use it for or what tools they can or cannot use. So you've got people using their own sort of shadow software, doing their own thing. I think that's the highest risk for your average business.
Which cybersecurity threats or trends should business keep an eye on today that might be overlooking?
Having a risk management program in your business is core, because depending on what your business is and what are the impacts to your business, depending on what thing happens or what infrastructure or what tools are violated or compromised, is going to be unique to every business. So whether it's, are you concerned about confidentiality? Do you have privacy risks? Is it an integrity? Is it an availability situation? So obviously you have to look at and understand your business, what those assets are, and then what is the threat landscape that's in there. But overall, if you say like overarching, where are the trends that I think are concerning that would affect more or less all businesses? I think the big ones are the organized crime landscape and how quickly it's adopting and scaling its cyber crime units. And then, you put AI on top of that. AI has really enabled everybody to clean up their social engineering game. So think earlier social engineering, you'd read an email. You could see by reading the email that the person that wrote it wasn't an Anglophone and English wasn't their first language. But now that's not a problem. Like somebody could write a message in Punjab and then like put a sample of my writing in there and say, translate this to English using the sort of style that Darren would use. And then all of a sudden you've got something like a ChatGPT translating from Punjab an email that sounds like I wrote it. And that's something that we see. And then, you can even take that even further. There's tools now where you can record samples of people's voice and do real-time voice where somebody could be talking in the microphone and it comes out as the other person in a very convincing way. Those are some things there. And then, of course, we have these AI tools and bots that you can go out to do reconnaissance work. And you can actually go online in the dark web and rent access to these tools. So they'll literally go out and scan and they'll find certain avenues that are likely. So then your people can be more efficient. The bots can go out and find vulnerable candidates, and then your humans can spend their time working on the vulnerable candidates. And then I guess down the road, there is quantum computing and how that's going to affect our encryption. So we've learned recently that somewhere in China, somebody has figured out how to decrypt AES-256, which is how pretty much every single hard drive on the last 10 years been encrypted. And that in some cases, we consider that a device that's encrypted with that and the encryption key is thrown away, that data is not available to humans. And well, that's not going to be the case for much longer. So I think that's going to be a big challenge in terms of how do we encrypt data in a way that we can be confident that data at rest is not going to be able to be compromised. And what do we do about all the data that we assumed is unreadable that may now be readable?
Are there specific regions or countries that you find particularly promising for tech talent?
The thing that's interesting now is the traditional barriers to an education are just gone. I mean, sure, if you want to have a Harvard degree, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors around that kind of stuff. You could probably get just as good as an education online without spending little to no money. I think you see a lot of tech talent popping up in regions where you don't think it exists. I mean, I've worked with some really brilliant developers in South America and Brazil. I've seen a lot in Colombia and Chile, even seeing a lot of growth happening in Caribbean islands where people are learning and they have a hunger for knowledge. Eastern Europe has always been a hotspot for talent. I've worked with people from Romania that have been brilliant, from Hungary. I think really it's kind of a borderless thing now. If you've got the internet and you've got some grit and a willing to learn, you don't need a university or a high-end university in your region to become really talented. If you're into computers and you want to learn, and now especially with AI, like AI can be a really great tool to help and another sort of tool in your toolbox to learn to be a developer or learn to be an IT person. So we're seeing applicants come in from all over the world in places I never would have thought, but it really does make sense. It's the leveling of the playing field right now.
IT outsourcing is a major trend in the tech industry. What are your thoughts on the advantages and disadvantages?
I like outsourcing in all areas. We have outsourced historically in our technology. We currently outsource now in a lot of other fields. We outsource a little bit in sales development. We outsource. My executive assistant is outsourced in Latin America. We recently hired a customer support rep who does, has some technical IT support elements that we've outsourced. Some of the advantages, for example, as a Canadian company, there's a lot of taxes in Canada. So when I hire a person, they and I have to contribute to a fairly aggressive tax infrastructure. So that's money that I have to spend that does not go into my employee's bank account, and therefore they can't use that money to buy things. So the cost of hiring employees when you have such a tax base and you have a higher cost of living in the region is pretty high. So there certainly is a financial benefit to hiring people in countries where there's a more favorable tax environment and a more favorable cost of living. So that's a big one. I think also another one is like, in my experience of hiring and of outsourcing, is taking some of that human resource risk off the table, depending on what country, province, state you're in. Sometimes employment laws can be a little bit of an enemy for a business. Like there's all kinds of rights that employees have that have been written in law that derive from like maybe the olden days when it was like mines and the company owned the community, and some of those rights can get turned against you. And I've had cases where we've laid off an employee for completely legitimate reasons. They make a lot of trouble for us. So like when you outsource, you fall under a different category of law, and it can reduce the exposure. Employees are, in Canada especially, it really does depend on the state, because there's what people determine to be as like employer-friendly states. There are companies that will only hire employees from certain states. They have like a blacklist of states they won't hire. And so
wow, I didn't even know about this.
Yeah, so it's like I'm all for employee rights. I don't believe in people being treated like shit, but at the same time, it can go the other way. And there are risks and exposures, and there's legal costs and human resource costs in terms of how you have to make sure you cover yourself. When you outsource, you reduce some of those risks. If you're working with a reputable firm, it can be easier to solve problems. Like you can go back to the firm and say, hey, this guy was really good, but this person here is not working out. And they'll go sort that out, right? So when you're a founder, you have to think about the more you can simplify the operational overhead and greater efficiency, the more you can focus on the things that matter the most in the business. I used to be in the thought of like, I want all my product and all my development to be under my control and under my purview. And that's how I've built businesses historically. But I've had some experiences where changed my perspective on that. And we're starting to outsource more now than we ever have. And I would say in my next endeavor, I'd probably start with the outsourcing. There's also like the ability to reduce commitment in there as well, which I think, again, it's legal exposure. And the other part of it, too, is if you're hiring a reputable firm, their name is on the line as well. So it can take some of the onus of risk of like vetting the employee, vetting the contractor, vetting the individual to make sure that you're getting people that are already tested and qualified to do the work.
How do you see the role of IT outsourcing evolving in the context of your industry future needs and demands?
I think it will evolve. I think this is really me thinking culturally, right? Like I think a lot of people generically biasly hire people that look and sound a lot like themselves. I mean, there's literally data that proves that. In Canada, taking the Canadian example, and I think this would hold true for most major cities in the US as well, is we're becoming more multicultural. And so by becoming more multicultural, what you're having is you're creating work environments where people are getting more accustomed and used to working with people from other parts of the world. They're changing their biases by experience. And I think once you've become comfortable working with people from another culture and you've become comfortable and used to working through language barriers and things, I think it reduces the barrier to outsource. And when you look at the cost of living and how much that has risen in large cities, it's becoming prohibitive for businesses to actually hire talent because of the cost, right? I think when you take the rising costs in urban environments in North America, plus people becoming more comfortable with working in multicultural environments, I think you create a greater sense of urgency to search for other opportunities to find talent, and you remove that barrier, that fear barrier, that bias barrier. I know right now there's a massive growth in firms that are doing like offshoring or nearshoring. And it's not just in IT. There's a bunch of companies out there like Magic that are all about like, hey, we just specialize in executive assistants. And they go to places like the Philippines and they have like whole training program and a whole system there. And they sell the services of an executive assistant at a fraction of what you'd pay if you were to hire somebody in that role in, say, New York or Boston or something like that, right? I think we're going to see a lot more of this, especially in an economy where if you go back to 22, 23, we were kind of printing money there for a while. The startups were raising insane amounts of money based on a vision. And that's really a lot harder now. And I think people are back to bootstrapping. And so they're counting their pennies more. We see the rise in firms and companies that are providing outsourcing across the full spectrum: sales, marketing, executive assistants, IT. If you think about like IT is a big category, but you see like IT in terms of managed service providers, managed security service providers, but also developers and software testers and all that kind of stuff. I think you're going to see a lot more of that very quickly. And you're going to see companies becoming more open to that as they become more unbiased and more multiculturally aware.
In your experience, what are the key factors to consider when deciding whether to outsource a particular function of the project?
It's going to be talent first. So where am I going to find the skill set that I need? Then it's going to be risk, and then it's going to be money. The risk one is sometimes, I think, the challenging one, and some of it's emotional. If you're a remote company and you hire somebody in Calgary and you're in Toronto, how is that any more or less risky than if you hire somebody in Budapest, right? It's not. But perception, sometimes people feel like, oh, well, now we got to analyze the risk. That person's in another country. Are they going to have access to PII? Are there rules? Are there regulations that do you need to put additional security measures in effect or data loss protection measures in effect? There's a little bit of that. But yeah, we look at it from in that order. It's really skill, risk, and then cost.
As we wrap up our conversation, what advice would you give to companies considering IT outsourcing but concerned about losing control over their technology projects?
Picking a good vendor and learning about the vendor you're working with is the core one. So do your research. talk to people who have worked with the organization that currently works or has worked in the past. Sometimes it's good to hear the success stories and the failures so you can really understand the scope. Obviously, if you're outsourcing and the IT involves access to a high degree of confidentiality or data privacy, you're going to have to do a risk assessment and understand, like, are there any risks that are associated? Is there any legal risks around accessing the data from outside of a particular region? So you want to understand that. Otherwise, like, try to onboard those people like they're part of your team, whether somebody's an employee legally or a contractor. I mean, I think you want to still build a culture and build a team, and you should be able to build a culture and treat your outsourced people in the same way that you treat your employees. And that's what we do here. We do the risk assessment. If there's a necessity to build in additional controls or additional logging or segregation because of any privacy risks, then that all comes up in the risk assessment if you do an appropriate risk assessment. And there's always mechanisms and controls and methods to cover all of those things. But yeah, go where the talent is and you'll build a better business. And especially if you're already remote anyways, then why would you limit yourself to your own country?
Darren, thanks very much for joining me today. It was an amazing conversation. You definitely have great experience, and this episode will be valuable for my audience. Thanks for joining me today.
Awesome, man. Thank you.
If you enjoy our discussion and want to stay updated on the future episodes, don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell. That way you will not miss out on the latest insights and conversations from the Devico Breakfast Bar.